welcome to everyone, both familiar faces and those that we have not met before. My name is Laura Boyce. I'm the Pennsylvania Executive Director of Teach Plus, and we are an organization that advances equity for students through teacher voice and teacher leadership. It's a pleasure to see you. I'm going to turn things over to Dan from the Public Interest Law Center, who's going to be leading our session today on the school funding lawsuit and what we can do to help push for funding equity for our students in Pennsylvania. So one more time, introduce yourself in the chat and take it away, Dan.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. Let me just see if I can pull this up. Did that pull up the presentation? Yep. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, for having me. I love talking to teachers. I do this kind of presentation for a lot of people and a lot of audiences, but doing it for parents and for teachers and for students is really the best thing. It's sort of why we exist. I'm a staff attorney at the Public Interest Law Center in Philadelphia. We are an impact litigation nonprofit law firm. We work across a number of areas, not just education. We were started as an affiliate of an organization called the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, which is a civil rights law firm that was started largely to protect the voting rights of people being registered to vote in the Jim Crow South. And then sort of split into these independent organizations. We now work across 6 subject areas: healthcare, public education, environmental justice, housing, employment, and voting. And it's through that work, through our focus on public education, that I come to this presentation. And the way that I'm going to structure this is I spend the first chunk of the presentation talking about the problem really as we see it. We'll talk about the lawsuit, but before you get to the lawsuit, it's I want to spend time about the why. Why do we need to file a lawsuit to begin with? And I think everyone knows inherently that there's things wrong with the Pennsylvania school funding system, but at least from my perspective, what is really going on with our funding, and then I'll get into the lawsuit too. I'll leave some time for questions at the end, you can, if there's a question about a particular chart and you want to jump in and ask, that's fine too, however is easier. But I'm just going to sort of talk about sort of the problem and one solution, and then I'll leave it open time for discussion. So the way I like to do this now is start with a little bit of table setting. And the first thing I show generally now is this article from the Inquirer, which is, as coronavirus closes schools, wealthier districts send laptops home with students. What about poor districts? Right? This is not a surprise, not a surprise to teachers. It's really not a surprise to the general public at this point, right? But it's an article talking about the differential way that poor kids are going to experience a pandemic as opposed to rich kids. What I think is actually amazing about this article is not this article, it's this. This article is from March 18th, 2020, right? So the first day schools were closed in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was March 16th, 2020, right? But by March 18th, the inequities and the fault lines in our society, right, are so obvious that by March 18th, it's already on the front page of the Inquirer that, hey, this whole class of kids are going to experience this way worse than their wealthy neighbors, right? If you're coming down from outer space, that would be a crazy thing to learn. That within a day you understood, right, that this crisis is not going to be felt remotely equally. And then one more thing, 2 sets of quotes. So who said this? Someone was talking about PCCY. It's PCCY that authored this quote. Pennsylvania has significant financial inequities in its system of school funding, with one of the largest gaps of any state in the country in per child spending between the Commonwealth's poorest and wealthiest districts, right? So huge gaps in the money coming in, and then of course, huge gaps in the results that come out. Another quote: the Commonwealth has some of the most significant reading achievement gaps between low-income students and students of color and their white, more affluent peers. right? Who said these things? Is it PCCY? Is it my organization? Is it Teach Plus? No, it's the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, right? This is from the Every Student Succeeds Act plan that the department issued, the Pennsylvania Department of Education issued just a year ago. And so as we go through this, the thing to know is that virtually everything I'm going to show you is just publicly available data. There's nothing secret about what I'm going to show you because all of this is just hiding in plain sight. All right, so when we look at the problem, there's some themes. The first is that in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, there is no goal of fully funding public schools, right? It's not as if the legislature starts each year by saying, hey, what do our schools need this year and how are we going to get there? What should our schools look like? How many teachers should we have? Or what's the outcome we want? How many kids do we want to be passing a certain thing? Or how many kids do we want to be getting into college at the back end? And then how do we get there? Right? That conversation does not happen. What happens is the legislature says, how much did we give to schools last year? Okay, let's add 1%. Let's add 1.5%. Let's add 2%. Let's add 0. But it's never actually grounded in what do children need this year. Now, those conversations do happen at the local level if your district is fortunate enough to be able to afford to have those conversations, right? So if you're a wealthy district, a middle income district, your superintendent goes to the board each year and says, this is what I need this year for our kids, right? I want to add this program. I want to hire this staff. And the board, maybe through a tax increase, maybe not, generally approves what the educational program the superintendent wants to implement, and you move on. But if you're a low-income district, the conversations you have are, what can we afford to do this year? Or maybe what do we have to cut this year? And that all stems from the failure of the state itself to adequately fund public schools. The second is that Pennsylvania makes a low relative state contribution to education, which I'll show you in a second. The third is that most of our funding is not based on any rational formula. This is the hold harmless issue. But the fourth is that when you put it all together in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, low-wealth communities need the most, try the hardest, and have the least. I'll explain each of those. So if you looked at every state in the country and you wanted to say within that state, how much of the money that's spent on education comes from the state itself as opposed to local taxpayers, Pennsylvania always ranks near the bottom, right? In other words, we are a state that is heavily reliant on local taxes as opposed to state funds, right? We really heavily rely on local taxes, local taxpayers coming up with their own funding system. And when you are coming up with their own funding, and when you have a really segregated state, not just racially, but economically, you have huge disparities as a result of that. Now, I can show you that in this next slide. So what you're looking at is every school district in Delaware County, right? Plus Philadelphia on the bottom for some reference. And the column that's titled Equalized Mills, Tax Burden Equalized Mills, that's what the state thinks is the effective property tax rate in those school districts. So the state wants to be able to compare tax efforts across counties. And so it has a board that tries to actually give an effective tax rate for each school district. And so the way you find out what the state actually thinks that effective tax rate is if you go to the Radnor Township School District, tax burden 14.8 equalized mills, divide that by 10. And that 1.48% is what the state thinks is the effective tax on property in Radnor, right? You go all the way down to the William Penn School District, 34.6 equalized mills. The state thinks that the William Penn School District pays about 3.5% of the value of their property each year in property taxes. And I'm sorry, their property tax rate is 3.5% of the value of their property each year. And so what you see just in Delaware County is there's a huge range in tax rates, right? And that could be a problem, particularly since a district like William Penn can afford to pay those taxes the least, or sort of is among the least in Delaware County and is without question, a low wealth community. But the real problem is the next column over, right? And the next column over is how much funding is generated from that tax rate. So go back to Radnor in the middle. Radnor taxes 14.8, equalized mills 1.5% of the value of their property. They generate $22,000 per kid from that tax rate. But the William Penn School District, taxing at a rate far higher, generates $8,800 per kid. Right? Philadelphia, for some reference, and it's a mixture of a bunch of different taxes in Philadelphia because we have a little bit of a different system, but Philadelphia is well above the state median in the effort it's putting into funding its schools. It generates $7,700 per child. One of the takeaways I want you to leave with this is that this is not an issue of low wealth communities not trying. In fact, those communities are generally trying the hardest. So let's compare a couple of extreme examples, purposely extreme. New Hope in Bucks County versus Reading. One of our wealthiest versus one of our poorest school districts. So New Hope taxes at a rate of 12.6 equalized mills. Again, 1.26% of the value of their property. That's their effective tax rate each year. They generate $25,000 per kid from that tax rate, right? There's a lot of big houses in New Hope. And so the state kicks in $4,600. And so state and local resources combined, New Hope has $30,000 per child. The Reading School District taxes at a rate of 26 equalized mills, more or less, 2.6% of the value of their property. But they don't generate $2,500 per kid. They don't generate $25,000 per kid. They generate $2,500 per kid, right? Now, the state does give more to Reading than it does to New Hope. So it gives $10,700 to New Hope, to Reading, as opposed to the $4,600 it does to New Hope, but it's not nearly enough to make up those differences. And so state and local resources combined, a place like Reading has $17,000 less to spend per kid than New Hope. Now, intuitively, I think we understand, right, that Reading probably has a greater need for funds than New Hope. So the easiest way to look at the need of a school district, and this is pretty well settled in education policy as well as common sense at this point, is look for the presence of children, children in poverty. Because as a general matter, kids in poverty are coming in with higher needs, right? So in New Hope, 9.7% of students are in poverty. In Reading, it's 95% of students in poverty. In New Hope, 2.8% of kids are learning English, another resource-needy group of kids, where you, by definition, need smaller class sizes to get kids up to speed. In Reading, it's 26%. So the takeaway, and this is a purposeful extreme example, right? But Reading has a much higher need than New Hope. They're trying much harder, and they have far less, right? That's Pennsylvania's school funding system. So how did we get here? So in 1991, we entered into this ice age of Pennsylvania school funding. The state had, up until that point, a school funding formula that looked at various characteristics of a district to say how much your funding should be this year. And then after 1991, the state stopped using it. So instead of looking at how a school district changed year after year, the state stopped doing that in 1991. Instead, they just started giving you basically what you got last year, plus 1%, plus 0, plus 2%, but it was all based on what you looked like in 1991. In terms of how do we get here? So, why do I show these pictures? Sort of a Rorschach test, depending on the age of an audience. But in 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev was finishing out his term, his final few months as premier of the Soviet Union. And there was still a Soviet Union, at least for a few months. George H.W. Bush was president. Barack Obama was the president of the Harvard Law Review, and LeBron James was 8 years old. Right? A lot has changed since 1991. But what hasn't really changed, largely, with very small exceptions, is how Pennsylvania is viewing school districts. They're still just looking at these 1991 statistics year after year and just giving school districts funding largely based on what they look like, with some very limited exceptions. The other thing to know is that not only were we stuck in an ice age, but there were pieces of litigation that had been brought in the 1990s, including by my office, challenging the school funding system in Pennsylvania. So there was a case brought by parents and by the school district of Philadelphia itself against against Pennsylvania for adequately funding schools. There was a case brought by parents in the Philadelphia School District alleging race discrimination under federal law. And there was a case brought by an organization called the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools, which you'll hear about again in a minute, alleging that the state was inadequately funding public schools. And all of this is bubbling up at the same time in sort of the late 1990s. But one by one, all of these cases failed for various reasons. The United States Supreme Court made it virtually impossible to sue a state for race discrimination for a piece of legislation in an unrelated case. And in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said, you effectively can't sue for allegations of inadequate education under Pennsylvania law, under the Pennsylvania Constitution, because we as a court can't determine what's an adequate education. That's really a policy matter. And it effectively, seemingly at least, closed the courthouse doors to litigants. So all these cases failed. And when that happened, there was a push in the political arena to try again to fix this problem. And so, and this is again sort of the Cliff Notes version of how we got here. So we can leave some time open for discussion. But in 2007, the legislature commissions a study to finally measure how much school funding is needed. So I said that there is no goal of adequately funding schools in Pennsylvania. Well, there was a 3-year exception. So the legislature, on a bipartisan basis, studied how much funding was needed. And then for 3 years, when the answer was $4.4 billion, for 3 years, they began regular increases with the goal of, after 6 years, of at least increasing school funding by $2.4 billion. The last 2 of those increases were during the Great Recession. And the state made a calculated decision that was Governor Rendell at the time, which said, our state treasury our state funds have dropped, or our austerity is going around the country. We're going to use our stimulus dollars to keep up the promises that we've made to school districts. And when the state treasury recovers, we'll replace it with state funds. Governor Rendell left office, however, right? Tom Corbett came in and he immediately axed $850 million from public education. Not just all that money, that stimulus funding, but other money that had been particularly important to low-wealth school districts, from charter school reimbursements to tutoring funds. It was a laser-guided missile directed at low-wealth school districts. The impact for those who lived through it, particularly those who were in classrooms, is obvious, right? So statewide, thousands of jobs are lost. Class sizes are up all over the place. In Philadelphia, just as an example, Philadelphia lost $300 million in a single year. And, when that happens, districts make short-term decisions that might hurt the long-term. So Philadelphia didn't just close 23 schools in its first year, didn't just lay off counselors and nurses, had no non-teaching staff, I think, in the first fall back after these cuts. They stopped spending things like on capital maintenance. You look at their spending on building maintenance, it plummeted, right? But the impact of that is profound. So this is a child who was in a school in Northeast Philadelphia, and the roof, or the ceiling, was leaking. There was a pipe leaking in the ceiling. It wasn't fixed. And as a result, the paint was peeling and falling onto his desk, and it was lead paint. Right? He ate the paint and was profoundly poisoned, right? I mean, we can talk about the general goals of education, and they are important, but these have huge, serious impacts on the health and safety of the people in those classrooms. And we have a lot of teachers here. There's a teacher in Philadelphia who was diagnosed with mesothelioma. For those in Philadelphia, you hear a lot in the state about Philadelphia getting too much, and it's often a part of the politics in Harrisburg. In fact, since those cuts, Philadelphia specifically is the only school district to never have recovered from its state funding. So Philadelphia today still gets less, excuse me, still gets less state funding than it did when Governor Rendell was in office today. Still gets $87 million less. Adjusted for an inflation, it's almost $400 million in the hole. Statewide, Governor Corbett leaves office. And again, it's not a partisan talk, but the reality is that the single biggest reason that Tom Corbett was a one-term governor were these education cuts, right? Education was a huge part of that campaign, his reelection campaign. Tom Wolf comes in as this friend of public education and came in with big hope and big promises. He came in and proposed that he would give, sorry, it's in my throat, that he would give $2 billion to public education in his first 4 years, including $500 million first to the districts that were most hurt by those Tom Corbett budget cuts. And then he hit the reality of Harrisburg, right? The immovable wall in Harrisburg. So instead of $2 billion over 4 years, in his first 2 years, he got $350 million. And over his first 6 years, he got $700 million. So he wanted $2 billion in 4 years, and he got $700 million in 6 years. And if you just count inflation, we've actually fallen further behind in Pennsylvania. We are $100 million behind, which is to say that we're really still living with Tom Corbett's budget cuts in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania 6 years later. Something good did happen at the same time, which is that the state enacted the fair funding formula, which a lot of you, I'm sure, at least have some knowledge of. And here's the way the fair funding formula works. It was enacted in 2016. And what the formula does is it says, it's a formula that actually does look at the relative needs of a school district. It looks at your student population and it says, how many kids do you have that are in poverty? How many kids do you have that are in concentrated poverty? How many kids do you have that are learning English? How many kids do you have that are going to charter schools? And it gives you these multipliers. So you start with 1,000 students, but then you get all of these multipliers, and the state's view of you becomes sort of more and more inflated the needier you are. It's a way the state can actually sort of measure the relative need from district to district. But there are some fundamental flaws with the fair funding formula. The first is that it purposefully excludes the total funding needed. Or I said, the state of Pennsylvania does not try to adequately fund public schools. Well, the state of Pennsylvania does not try to measure how much schools need either. And so this formula is only a way to split up an existing pot. If we're giving $1 million, what percentage goes to Reading? What percentage goes to New Hope? But it doesn't actually tell you how much New Hope needs or how much Reading needs. It doesn't tell you whether they've gotten it. It just is how we are going to divide this finite pie. It's also, as a result, a zero-sum game, right? If one district gets more because they're needier, another district, by definition, gets less because we're not saying every district needs enough. It also only applies to funding added after its adoption. So what I mean by that is that before this fair funding formula was enacted, the state gave out about $5.5 billion in basic education funding. And it was through that old system based on what you look like in 1991, largely. That $5.5 billion still goes out based on what you look like in 1991. Same system, still goes out the exact same way. The only thing that goes through the formula is the money above $5.5 billion. So now we're up to that $698 million that I said the governor has gotten in the last 6 years. That's the money that goes through the formula. But the $5.5 billion still goes through the old crazy system. And so if you started over in the formula, if you started over by running all of the money through the formula, saying, we're just going to put all this money through this formula, which talks about the relative needs of district to district, about $1.2 billion would switch from school district to school district to school district, right? But it's a zero-sum game, right? And so colleague at Education Voter, Susan Spica, is fond of calling this the Hunger Games of Pennsylvania education funding, right? And that's really what it is. It's the Hunger Games. It's saying that you as a district, to get more, the only way you can get more is if another district gets less. Let me show you what that means. So I talked about $1.2 billion in inequity. This is the hold harmless problem, right? So if we put all the money through the formula, immediately the York School District would get $46 million additional in basic education funding, $5,700 per kid. Reading, who we talked a lot about, would get $4,700 per child. Profound amount of funding, desperately needed. But just like those districts would get more, other districts would get less, right? So Reading might get $4,700, but the Southside Area School District loses $7,800 per student, right? And some of these districts that you see here may themselves not have enough funding. They're relatively better off, certainly, than Reading and York and Allentown, but they themselves still may feel like they don't have enough funding. And they may not, because we don't actually measure it in Pennsylvania, right? But now the communities of York and the communities of Reading and the communities of Allentown and Philadelphia and on have to fight to essentially take funding from another school district, right? That's the premise of what the system that the state has created. That for you to be a winner, another district has to be a loser. And so that's not really the only problem with hold harmless, though. There's also another impact. This is from David Masenkis from the organization Power. And what you're looking at as of last year, and this will take a second to explain, but the vertical axis is how much, this is just state funding, only state funding, not state and local resources, just state funding, okay? Each dot here is a school district in Pennsylvania, okay? The vertical axis is how much per student funding you are getting this year or as of last year, right? The actual funding going to your district on a per student basis. The horizontal axis is how much you should be getting if all the money went through the formula, right? We said, okay, we have this formula, we're going to use it. This says what our belief is and the relative needs of school districts. We're going to put all the money through the formula. That's what's on the horizontal line, right? So the vertical line, how much you are getting. Horizontal line, how much you should be getting under the formula. Now, if we actually did run everything through the formula, they would be the same, right? Because what you are getting, say $5,000, would be the same as what you should be getting, $5,000, right? So those things would match up, which means that everyone would be along the dotted line, right? Because if I told you you should be getting $5,000, you would just go over to you are getting $5,000, everyone would be along the dotted line. Instead, everyone's all over the place, right? If you're above the line, you're a hold harmless winner. You're getting more than you would expect as a function of your value under the formula. If you're below the line, you're getting less than you would expect as a function of your value under the formula. Again, above the line, more than you'd expect. Below the line, less than you'd expect. Above the line, a hold harmless winner. Below the line, a hold harmless loser. So the median school district in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has 12% children of color. If you have less than the median number of children of color, you are a yellow dot. If you have more than 12% children of color, you're a brown dot. Again, if you're above the line, you're getting more than you'd expect as a function of the formula. If you're below the line, you're getting less than you'd expect, right? So not every underfunded district in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, not every underfunded district in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has a lot of children of color, but basically every district that has a lot of children of color is an underfunded district. And, I think that we have to ask ourselves, can we keep going on as a society that is so fractured that allows this kind of thing to exist? So that's the funding on the front end. And of course, standardized tests are not the be all and end all, but, in terms of why this matters, by any metric the state uses, low wealth districts are seriously struggling. Really, statewide, every district is struggling. But if you look at it, if you separate out economically disadvantaged kids in particular, they are not just doing poorly, they're doing especially poorly in the most underfunded districts, which is not a surprise because those districts don't have the resources that they need to bring those kids up to speed. And it's not just standardized tests. And again, like you can pick your measure, If you want to see, look at kids that are going into college. What our research has found, and what we'll prove in court, is that in Pennsylvania, a poor child in a well-funded district is not only more likely to go to college, they're more likely to graduate college than a poor child in a low-funded district. All of this stuff matters. So for that reason, we're suing. We're lawyers, that's what we do. So in November of 2014, as the Tom Corbett cuts were still raining down upon the Commonwealth, our organization, along with our partners at the Education Law Center of Pennsylvania, another great nonprofit law firm in Center City, and a pro bono partner at O'Melveny, a law firm by the name of O'Melveny Myers, representing a number of school districts, filed a lawsuit alleging that the legislature was violating the Pennsylvania Constitution. The Pennsylvania Constitution, like virtually every other state's constitution, has an education clause in it. The federal Constitution doesn't say a word about education, but virtually every state's constitution does. In fact, for states in the former Confederacy, having an education clause in their constitution was a condition of their readmission to the Union. Our education clause says that the General Assembly shall provide for the maintenance and support of a thorough and efficient system of public education to serve the needs of the Commonwealth. We are alleging that the General Assembly has failed in that duty. And we're also suing under the equal protection provisions of the Constitution, saying that there's massive disparities on the basis of wealth for some of the disparities I showed you at the beginning. We are suing on behalf of a cross-section of school districts in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the William Penn School District, right outside of Philadelphia, sort of inner ring suburb in Delco, the Panther Valley School District and the Shenandoah Valley School District, two small school districts in Schuylkill and Carbon counties, and then three urban school districts: Wilkes-Barre Area School District, School District of Lancaster, and Greater Johnstown School District. We're also representing the NAACP of Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools, as well as a group of parents, both from these districts and from Philadelphia. We are suing anyone who can make a difference, any state policymaker that has a legal responsibility. So that is the governor, the Secretary of Education, and the leaders of the House and Senate. And litigation is slow, but just to give you an idea of how long this has taken, the case was filed as I said, in November of 2014. The case was dismissed by the Commonwealth Court. There was this earlier cases that I talked about, which had at least implied that the doors were closed to these kinds of cases, because we were alleging the legislature had failed its duty to adequately fund public schools. And there was an earlier case that had implied that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court did not believe that a court could define what's an adequate education to begin with. So we had a good reason to believe that the story would be different this time. We had some legal theories, but we also knew it would likely end up in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and that's where it did. The case was filed in November 2014, dismissed in 2015. We finally had argument in September 2016 in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and in September of 2017, the Supreme Court reopened the courthouse doors, ruled we were right, that we could bring this kind of case, and said, you can go forward. They didn't say we win the case overall, but they said, yes, there's a right here, if there's a right, there's got to be a remedy of some kind. And courts are here to hear claims that the legislature is not doing its job, that what the legislature is doing is unconstitutional, reviewing state laws. That's what courts do. There were some crazy arguments made in that Supreme Court argument that we may hear again as we go forward in this case, including that no child has the right to an individual education of any quality in Pennsylvania. Another argument that was made was that if the doors are open to public schools, if literally just the doors are open, the legislature has done its job. As long as there are schools, as long as they're open, the legislature has done its job. Thankfully, the Supreme Court did not accept those arguments and gave us a chance to prove our case. And so here we go. So we are asking the court to declare that Pennsylvania's current funding system is unconstitutional under state law. We want the legislature to stop using an inadequate and irrational scheme to fund its public schools. And we want them to create a system that actually asks the question, how much do schools need? And how are we going to get it to them, right? Because you can say it should be this kind of mix between state and local resources. But you have to actually ask those questions, and you have to give communities a path forward to meet that. We believe that the respondents are going to, some of the arguments we have heard in this case already is they're going to say, everything is fine. They'll say Pennsylvania spends a lot. When you look at national standardized test scores, Pennsylvania is doing fine. That funding formula that we talked about, we're only $700 million goes through it and $5.5 billion doesn't, and it's still not looking at how big the pie should be. That funding formula, it actually solves everything, or will solve everything. Just give us time, let it go. They're also going to make some pretty foundational arguments that that if we see success at some of these school districts, and they've asked our superintendents at depositions, for example, I mean, you have an honor roll, you have the National Honor Society at your school. There's kids on National Honor Society, right? And so what that means is that perhaps the kids that aren't in National Honor Societies just simply aren't taking advantage of the opportunities they're given. The implication being that it's going to be anyone's problem but theirs. That, it's children not taking advantage of opportunities. It's parents not pushing their kids. It's poverty. It's culture. It's anything but themselves, right? It's anything but their own system. We are going to need to actually once and for all get the court to decide what the Pennsylvania Constitution actually entitles in terms of the standard. We believe it's a high quality contemporary education, that every child is entitled to that in Pennsylvania. That means they are given the tools necessary to be college and career ready, to be good citizens. We will then show that that standard has not been met because there's not enough funding in the system. And so the lawsuit is nearing its conclusion. We hope that within, maybe even within days, we will actually know when this case is going to trial. But I think it's safe to say that sometime this year it will be going to trial. Discovery has concluded. We did over 70 depositions. There were over 70 depositions, often of our own clients. Number of compelling expert reports. This needs to be updated, but they filed these minor motions, but all those have been wiped away at this point. The only thing left now is a lot of work and trial. So we are in the process of grinding amounts of work to prepare for a trial, which will be, if I could guess, sometime around Labor Day, but we don't know for sure. The main point of this, right? The main reason why we're doing this, we don't want money for money's sake. We want money because money brings resources. Money brings educational strategies, right? We believe that all children can learn. We believe that if you can mitigate against poverty, you're not going to solve everything. But if you give children the resources they need, you will see significantly improved outcomes. One of the other things we've done in this case is, one of the questions we always get, well, how much do school districts need? And we don't have a perfect number for how much school districts need. But in state law, remember I said after that costing out study, the state had commissioned a study which said the state was underfunded by $4.4 billion. This is what the state enacted into law after that. It said, hey, Department of Education has to determine the adequacy target for each school district. So there was a spreadsheet where you could look and say, hey, how much is my school district underfunded according to state law? And then they were going to meet it within 6 years, right? So they calculated these adequacy targets each year. The last year they calculated it, schools were still underfunded by $4.5 billion. And again, they said, hey, we're in the furtherance of our goals, of our commitment to education, we're going to meet this by 2014, 6 years. We're going to meet these goals. So in 2011, amidst those huge budget cuts, this section was wiped off the map. No more goal of adequately funding public schools. So there was for 3 years this goal of adequately funding public schools. It was deleted. But what wasn't deleted from the statute was that formula, the Department of Education Child Determined Adequacy target for each school district, it's still sitting there. They just simply don't pay attention to it. And so as part of this case, we decided to run the formula for them. And what that formula found was that schools are underfunded by $4.6 billion, according to the state's own law. Just for some context, the scope of underfunding is huge, right? So in all of our districts, you're talking about at least $3,700 per kid. In the school district of Philadelphia, over $1 billion cumulatively in funding is needed. Which is all to say that, the scope of the problem is big. And I talked about the Hunger Games, and people can feel any number of ways about hold harmless. And I think hold harmless is a bad policy by itself. But the solution can't just be simply undoing hold harmless, right? So for some context, School District of Philadelphia would get $218 million more immediately if there was no hold harmless. They need that money, sure. But Philadelphia, under current state law, is underfunded by $1.1 billion, right? So ending hold harmless, again, there's some real merits to that. There's some downsides, but there are some merits to that. But it still doesn't solve our problem because we're not actually guaranteeing that every district has what they need, right? Education shouldn't be a zero-sum game, and it sure as heck shouldn't be the Hunger Games. We are bringing this lawsuit because we believe it will work. And in fact, there have been studies that have shown that when states are sued successfully in these kinds of cases, that more money ends up going to the districts that need it the most, and that over the long run, you see increased academic achievement, right? Because common sense and our common sense that money matters because money buys teachers, money buys reading specialists and math specialists, and money buys counselors, and it buys books. I mean, we understand that, but there's also now actually all sorts of really good research to say, yeah, of course money matters. And so our goal is once and for all to break the political impasse that is hanging over Harrisburg through this lawsuit. In terms of what you can do, so we, like Teach Plus, are part of the Pennsylvania Schools Work campaign. I'm going to encourage everyone to join it. But also, we have a website where you can follow the status of the lawsuit, funderschoolspa.org. As the lawsuit sort of comes really more into view, there will be more and more content as trial comes closer and closer on that website. So sign up. We're sending out newsletters. We'll be publishing information. And there's all sorts of things you can do. Get involved. If you're a part of local communities and you want me to come talk to your local community about Pennsylvania school funding, I'm happy to do that. I do this a lot in the era of Zoom, it's easy to effectively travel across the state to do this kinds of things. So reach out. Laura has my contact information. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. I will scan through these questions, but if anyone has any, or I'll scan through if there are any questions in the chat box, but if anyone has any, just please unmute yourself and ask away.
I have a question. Can anybody hear me?
Yep.
So Dan, I am working specifically in Johnstown with the minority parents. I'm also helping a woman run for school board, and I've witnessed the school board meetings, and I've looked at their budget. I've looked at their economically disadvantaged rate at the high school level. And what I found fascinating with some of the rural districts in Western PA is 50 to 60% of their budgets are funded by the state. So I don't understand why Johnstown is part of the lawsuit. And at what time did they enter the lawsuit? Because to me, they get a great deal of money from the state. Granted, it's block grant, it's the basic education funding, but 86% of their high school students are economically disadvantaged, and they have 100% free lunch. So I know, listening to the parents and the mothers in the district, that they don't feel like they're getting the resources, but I just wondered how they got involved in the lawsuit.
They got involved in the lawsuit.
They're getting a lot of money.
So they're not. I mean, that's the bluntest way I can put it is they're profoundly underfunded. They certainly, every poor district, so every poor district in Pennsylvania, more of their funding comes from the state or federal government than every wealthy district, right? Because the wealthy districts have those resources. But Johnstown overall is a profoundly underfunded district. Just huge amounts of inadequate funding. Johnstown, just for some context, is one of the poorest cities.
Absolutely. The median income is $22,000.
Yeah, and a city that went from 73,000 people, I think 70,000 people, something like that, to 27,000 people. Right. In Johnstown, they tried to raise their taxes to pay for school funding, despite the fact that they are so desperately poor. And their property values are so low that taxpayers simply fought reassessments and got their assessments lowered, and Johnstown actually lost money. So they do get more money. And I should say, Pennsylvania school funding, that the portion that comes from the state itself is irrational, it's inadequate, it's broadly progressive, in that there is the state funding itself certainly goes to the poorer school districts. So they are going to be, every poorer school district will be more dependent on state funds than every wealthier school district. The problem is there's not nearly enough funding. And so when you look at, there's a lot of measures by which you can look at underfunding, but by almost any measure, Greater Johnstown School District does not have nearly the dollars it needs to educate its children.
Well, I agree with that. I just wonder, I've watched these school board meetings, and the community has asked questions about their state funding, and they don't give them any answers. And I just wonder, it's still not enough, you're right, to operate, especially with the high percentage of economic disadvantage. I just didn't understand. So thank you.
Well, people, and I would say, so I'm going to say, in terms of where, my own personal loyalty lies by profession, they're my client. The school board is my client in this lawsuit. The superintendent is effectively our client. So
what year did they come?
My response will be very much defending our client.
No, that makes a lot of sense too. But what year did they? So were they from the very beginning in 2014?
Yep, every district has been there since the beginning. Yeah, and they were facing profound things. So so you've seen in Johnstown. So Johnstown was a school district that had 4 school buildings, 4 schools, 2 elementary schools, a middle school, and a high school, and they had so little money that the middle school was falling apart that they eventually just had to close it. They didn't close it because it was in the educational interest of their children. They closed it because they couldn't afford to fix it, and instead took their 2 elementary schools and turned one into a middle school and one into an extraordinarily overcrowded elementary school where kids are basically learning in closets in certain circumstances. So again, it is true they are funded more by the state than a wealthy neighbor, but they still, by any measure, just don't have nearly the funding that they need.
Thank you.
Sure. So someone said, doesn't money buy sufficient buildings? The answer is, of course, yes. We think every child is entitled to safety and to going to school in a modern, adequate facility, and that will be part of the case that we're proving too. Montel Brown, your question?
Yes, hi Dan. My name is Montel Brown. I'm a Teach Plus teacher leader alum from the School District of Philadelphia, and I just have a question about the time frame. So,
sure.
I know that we're just now going to trial coming up soon. What do you see as the time frame that we may see a remedy come out, given the fact that there's definitely going to be an appeal, and I'm sure the Pennsylvania Supreme Court is definitely going to want to take this case up. What do we see as the potential time frame for this case being, till we actually reach a remedy? And then I have a second part, but I just want to hear that.
Sure. Well, first, I like the premise of your question, which is that we're going to win. And I encourage optimism, but of course, we actually have to win. We'll be working late nights to try to make that happen. But of course, there is no guarantee that we win. But if we are lucky enough to win, there probably will be an appeal to the Supreme Court. I would say, if we win, it's less likely that there's an appeal. I mean, it's still more likely than not, but I think that the likelihood goes down. If we lose, you could be pretty certain we're going to appeal to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. But in North Carolina, the state legislature lost a similar case, and they actually didn't really appeal the decision. So it's really hard to give a firm timeline on when this lawsuit would result on more funding actually coming in. And I say that because a lot of it is dependent on, trial schedules and the judge in this case is going to have a huge job to try to take weeks, maybe 2 months worth of evidence and put it into a decision. It's going to probably take a while. I think almost under any circumstance that will not be that decision from the Commonwealth Court, win or lose, will not be in 2021. If I had to guess, it would be sometime in 2022, hopefully in early 2022. But I don't know. And then there is likely to be an appeal to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. We would try to do what we could to make that as fast as possible, but it can take a while. We filed an appeal to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in 2015. As I said, they heard the case in 2016 and gave us a decision in 2017. So I really don't have a firm answer. I will tell you that if we win, one of the things we will say on day one post victory, if we are lucky enough to win a Commonwealth Court, is we don't need to wait for an appeal to fix this problem. We can just fix it right now. And that will obviously depend on the willingness of the legislature to work with us. It's a long way of saying I don't know. It's up in the air, and so I can't say hold on for another one school year, because in the following school year we're going to win and this money is going to be flowing. In reality, what happens with these cases is that it's one of the reasons why it's so important to have people involved, is that the legislature is given some time to fix the problem. And, whether they make sort of a true good faith effort to do it is often in part based on how much political pressure they feel to finally fix it. And so we really need people engaged. Sorry, I need another part of your question.
Yeah, so you started to touch on it. I'm just thinking back to the Brown v. Board of Education decision and how the Supreme Court made their ruling and people just didn't want to follow it. So I'm curious to see if that's a possibility here, or if there's any thoughts about how, if and when we win on this case for school funding, if the legislature just ignores or just decides to ignore the ruling of the court, how we can ensure that doesn't happen. You talked about the political pressures. So is that really the route we need to go for that? Or I'm curious to see your thoughts on that.
Another great question. So it's an everything, a yes and strategy. What the case gives huge amounts of practical leverage. And courts are good at enforcing their orders, but when you're talking about billions of dollars, it's a little bit more challenging, right? So if I sued the state legislature for violating a contract, and I said, I had a contract for professional services with the state legislature and they owe me $1 million, and the legislature refused to pay. Eventually, a judge would just say, I order the state treasurer to write a check for $1 million. It's done, right? When you're talking about potentially billions of dollars, a court can't do that, right? The court is not going to raise taxes. The court is not going to, is not going to write out district by district who gets what. They're going to give instructions, maybe broad, maybe specific, but ultimately it's going to be the legislature's duty to fix it. And so what happens around the country is it's really a mix. So you definitely have states where there are standoffs and where judges then use their inherent power to try to end that standoff. So in Kansas, after a long struggle, the Kansas Supreme Court finally said, this was, I think, in the beginning of the summer, we've had enough. If you don't fix this, no schools can open in the fall. In the state of Washington, the legislature was fined $100,000 a day by a judge. In other states, you see a faster remedy when when the political branch feels more pressure to act. And so it really is an everything strategy. You know, it's creating the conditions by which the legislature is going to do its job. You know, there is no strategy by which sort of a standalone funding case is going to win. You know, it's a standalone funding case with a huge campaign at the same time to educate Pennsylvanians on why funding is important.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions, Laura, that you see?
Well, an announcement to make sure that everybody saw, we put it into the chat as well. But if you are feeling really fired up and wanting a specific concrete way to advocate, the Fund Our Schools PA campaign is looking for spokespeople, and teachers and parents make great spokespeople. I know that we have folks here today from Allentown and Scranton and Harrisburg and Western PA. And so we've got a lot of folks from Southeast Pennsylvania, although if you're here from Philly or the surrounding areas, please feel free to also sign up. But we'd love to have your voices be a part of the messaging around the trial and share some of the stories of how underfunding has affected your school or your district. And Teach Plus, you know, we are very actively working on this issue, expecting to talk to legislators over the course of this spring. So if you're in our teacher network, be on the lookout for opportunities. If you're really passionate about this issue, be looking for opportunities to sign up for our policy fellowship or to apply for our policy fellowship for next year, where we'll continue to be working on this in a more intensive way. And yeah, let's go back to any questions to close this out.
So I see a question from Jessica Keys asking, have there been any studies that might project how many years it would take for underfunded schools to see growth or results from a better funding formula? I don't know that I have it off the top of my head, but there have been studies that have tracked this. So there's been, in the last 5 or 10 years, there's been a lot of really good research on tracking the impact of funding increases to public schools. So Rucker, Johnson, and Carabo-Jackson have used state lawsuits, because there are a lot of these state lawsuits that sometimes result in like sudden infusions of money into schools to actually track that. And I don't know the years off the top of my head, but what they show is that there is obviously a lag in terms of seeing big increases in achievement, but that increase in achievement becomes cumulative, right? As you would expect, as the money goes through, you're building upon each year, you're building upon, you know, additional years of adequately funding schools. It's not like, you know, I mean, we all know this, but it's not like you can take an 11th grader who's been in an underfunded school for his entire education and give him a really good, you know, adequately funded education for 12th grade and expect like everything to be better. If it was that simple, we would just do that for 1 year. I don't have the years in front of me, but the Rucker, Johnson, Carabo-Jackson research about this is the best to read, and it's pretty readable. Rucker Johnson himself has a really good book talking about the impact of integration, pre-K, and adequately funded public schools. And one of the more compelling things he talks about is, you know, everyone, you hear this said a lot in the pre-K world, that, you know, all the benefits of something like Head Start go away by 3rd grade. And so kids come to kindergarten ready to learn, but then by the time they're at 3rd grade, it all falls away. And what his research shows is that is true to a certain extent if you send that kid to an underfunded school, right? To a certain extent. And there's actually some, and there's some people that even dispute that, but that you do see lower impacts of pre-K if the kid goes to an underfunded school. But if you see, if that kid goes to an adequately funded public school, in fact, the impact continues to accumulate, right? Because things just build upon themselves. So it's one of the things we're going to have to prove at the trial. I don't see any others. I hope I'm not missing any. If you had a question here and I'm not seeing it, feel free to jump on. But I think that's it. Just make sure. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. This has been really informative. And I know that we have a lot of folks who are fired up and ready to get advocating on this. So again, stay tuned for more from Teach Plus. We will share out this recording if you'd like to watch it again or share it with others. And if you're interested in having Dan or some of the other folks from the lawsuit present in your area, just get in touch with me and I can connect you with him and the rest of the group. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.